I rise today in conjunction with my colleague from Oregon to discuss what's before us here on the floor, which is the extension of the PATRIOT Act. And I rise as well to express my opposition to the extension of the three most controversial provisions of the PATRIOT Act, which are before us here today. The process by which we've considered these provisions has been rushed, and I believe we've done a disservice to the American people by not having a fuller and more open debate about these provisions. Now, I think along with Senator Wyden, I want to acknowledge the difficult position that the leader of the Senate has been in, Senator Reid. And I want to thank him for trying to find an agreement to vote on more amendments. We were very close to reaching that agreement. But even in that context, the debate we've had on this bill is insufficient. And if you look at what we're about to approve, it's a one-page bill which just changes the dates in the existing PATRIOT Act. This is a lost opportunity, Mr. President. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, I can tell you that what most people, including many members of Congress, believe is that the PATRIOT Act allows the government to do what it allows the government to do, and what government officials privately believe the PATRIOT Act allows them to do. Those are two different things. Senator Wyden has been making that case, and I want to make it as well. And I can't support the extension of the provisions we're considering today without amendments to ensure that there's a check on executive branch authority. And I don't believe that the Coloradans who sent me here to represent them would accept this extension either. Mr. President, Americans would be alarmed if they knew how this law is being carried out. I appreciate the Intelligence Committee Chairwoman, Dianne Feinstein, working with us to hold hearings in the committee to examine how the administration is interpreting the law. I believe that is a critical step forward. However, that addresses only the overarching concern. I still have concerns about the individual provisions that we are considering today. We just voted to invoke cloture, to cut off debate on the 4-year extension of provisions that give the government wide-ranging authority to conduct wiretaps on groups and individuals or collect private citizens' records. And I voted no because the debate should not be over without a real chance to improve these authorities. I recently supported a 3-month extension so that the Senate could take time to debate and amend the PATRIOT Act. We were promised that debate. But that opportunity is literally slipping through our hands. I'd like to stay here and continue making the case to the American people that this bill should and could be improved. And Mr. President, while a number of PATRIOT Act provisions are permanent and remain in place to give our intelligence community important tools to fight terrorism, the three controversial provisions we are debating, commonly known as roving wiretap, lone wolf, and business records, are ripe for abuse and threaten Americans' constitutional freedoms. Now, I know we must balance the principles of liberty and security, and I firmly believe that terrorism is a serious threat to the United States, and we must be sharply focused on protecting the American people. In fact, with my seats on the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, much of my attention is centered on keeping Americans safe, both here and abroad. And I also recognize that despite Osama bin Laden's death, we still live in a world where terrorism is a serious threat to our country, our economy, and to American lives. Our government does need the appropriate surveillance and anti-terrorism tools to achieve these important goals. However, we need to and we can strike a better balance between protecting our national security and the constitutional freedoms of our people. Let me give you an example. This debate has failed to recognize that current surveillance programs need improved public oversight and accountability. I know that Americans believe that we ought to only use PATRIOT Act powers to investigate terrorist or espionage-related targets. Yet Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act, the so-called business records provision, currently allows records to be collected on law-abiding Americans without any connection to terrorism or espionage. If we cannot limit investigations to terrorism or other nefarious activities, where do they end? The Coloradans are demanding that in addition to the review of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, we place common sense limits on government investigations and link data collection to terrorist or espionage-related activities. Or should I say when Congress passes this bill to extend the PATRIOT Act until 2015, it will mean that for 4 more years, the federal government will have access to private information about Americans who have no connection to terrorism without sufficient accountability and without real public awareness about how these powers are used. Again, I want to underline, we all agree the intelligence community needs effective tools to combat terrorism, but we must provide these tools in a way that protects the constitutional freedoms of our people and lives up to the standard of transparency that democracy demands. And again, I want to say that as a member of the Intelligence Committee, while I cannot say how this authority is being used, I believe it is ripe for potential abuse and must be improved to protect the constitutionally protected privacy rights of individual, innocent American citizens. Toward that goal, I've worked with my colleagues to come up with common sense fixes that could receive bipartisan support. For example, Senator Wyden and I filed an amendment that would require the Department of Justice to disclose the official legal interpretation of the provisions of the PATRIOT Act. This would make sure that the federal government is only using these powers in ways the American people believe they are authorizing them to. And while I believe that our intelligence practices should be kept secret, I do not believe that the government's official interpretation of these laws should be kept secret. This is an important part of our oversight duties, and I look forward to working with Chairwoman Feinstein in the Intelligence Committee to ensure that this oversight occurs. I've also filed my own amendments to address some of the problems I see with the roving wiretap, lone wolf, and business record provisions. For example, I joined Senator Wyden in filing an amendment designed to narrow the scope of the business records materials that can be collected under Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act. And I just highlighted some of the problems with that provision. Our amendment would still allow enforcement agencies to use the PATRIOT Act to obtain investigation records, but it would also require those entities to demonstrate that the records are in some way connected to terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities. Today, law enforcement currently can obtain any kind of records. In fact, the PATRIOT Act's only limitation states that such information has to be related to, quote, any tangible thing, unquote. That's right. As long as these business records are related to any tangible thing, the U.S. government can require businesses to turn over information on their customers, whether or not there's a link to terrorism or espionage. I got to say, I just don't think it's unreasonable to ask that our law enforcement agencies identify a terrorism or espionage investigation before collecting the private information of law-abiding American citizens. These amendments, Mr. President, represent but a few of the reform ideas that we could have debated this week. But without further debate on these issues, this or any other administration, whether intentionally or unintentionally, can abuse the PATRIOT Act. And because of the need to keep classified material classified, Congress cannot publicly fulfill our oversight responsibilities on behalf of the American people. So, Mr. President, as I started out my remarks, I plan to vote against the reauthorization of these 3 expiring provisions because we've failed to implement any reforms that would sensibly restrain these overbroad provisions. In the nearly 10 years since Congress passed the PATRIOT Act, there's been very little opportunity to improve this law. And I, for one, am very disappointed that we are once again being rushed into approving policies that threaten the privacy, which under one definition is the freedom to be left alone of the American people. It's a fundamental element and principle of freedom. The bill that is before us today, in my opinion, doesn't live up to the balanced standards the framers of our Constitution envisioned to protect both liberty and security, and I believe it seriously risks the constitutional freedoms of our people. And by passing this unamended reauthorization, we are ensuring that Americans will live with the status quo for 4 more long years. I'm disappointed, and I know that many of our constituents would be disappointed if they were able to understand the implications of our inaction on these troubling issues. Mr. President, as I close, I just want to say there's a gravitational pull to secrecy that I think we all have as human beings. It's hard to resist it, and the whole point of the checks and balances that our founders put in place was to ensure that power couldn't be consolidated and then power abused, again, whether intentionally or unintentionally. We'd all like to be king for a day. We all have ideas about how we could make the world a better place. But we know the dangers in giving that much of power to one person or one small group of people. Ben Franklin put it so well. I can't do justice to his remarks in the way that he stated them, but to paraphrase him, he said that a society that would trade essential liberty for short-term security deserves neither. And our job as senators is to ensure that we actually enjoy both of those precious qualities, security and liberty. So thank you, Mr. President. This is an important vote today. This is an important undertaking. And I know we can, through the leadership of Senator Wyden and many of us who care deeply about this, ensure that the PATRIOT Act keeps faith with the principles that we hold dear.